All right, so today's video is going to be full range of motion, a brief analysis. We're going to dive into what full range of motion is, what it isn't, and we're going to basically dive not too deep into it today. It's going to be pretty brief, as you can tell by the title, but I do want to have a full video at some point in the future. Today, we're going to be covering kind of the basics of my thoughts on full range of motion, a little bit on partials, and how to optimally train to get the best possible results using this tool to your advantage. So before I get too deep into this video, I do want to say Stan Strength was kind enough to have me featured on his channel with a little bit of kind of like an interview and a lifting discussion going over a few different hypertrophy topics. So if you want to check out Stan Strength's video, I think the title was, oh, what was it? It was so funny. It was like Bodybuilder Destroys Power Builder with Facts and Logic. It was kind of a legendary title. So I do recommend checking out that video. It's a little bit longer. It's about 2 hours. So if you're at work and want to listen to a podcast or something, go for it. We cover a lot of cool topics in it. So I'd recommend it. He's a really smart dude, and I think you can learn a ton from his points. So to get into today's video about full range of motion, first point I have here is that full range of motion is actually rarely achieved through just one lift. So one of the first lifts that I want to use as an example is going to be, let's say, a really good lift like the Romanian deadlift. As much as I love that lift, it's incomplete for training your glutes and hamstrings because it's not actually a full range of motion, at least for your hamstrings. So let's dive into that a little bit. When you're doing an RDL, you can basically get a full stretch on your hamstrings. You can get super low. You can even stand and do it in a deficit if your mobility is really good and you're very flexible. However, the problem is you're not actually getting a full contraction on your hamstrings. So I'm not going to dive too deep into this example, but let's say you're doing an RDL because it's like a full range of motion. Technically, no, it's a full stretch, which is a very important part of the range of motion, but it's incomplete for your entire workout, and you do need to have some type of actual contraction. When you're doing an RDL, you can go as low as you need to, and there's a bunch of different ways to achieve that. So yes, you are getting a full stretch, which is really important, but at the same time, you're not getting a full contraction because even if you stand up, lock out your knees and hips, your hamstrings still aren't in their contracted state. They're just in their regular state because you're just standing up. To get a full contraction, you do need to have some type of hamstring curl, and that can be whatever variation you like, whether it's a machine curl or even like a more advanced movement like a Nordic hamstring curl. Basically, a RDL doesn't cover that entire range of motion. So you do need to have both to have a complete workout. So that's just one example. The more you think about it, the more it applies to every lift. Even a bicep curl, for example, there's a bunch of different ways to do these, like a preacher curl, even just a regular barbell. Let's take the preacher, for example. Your elbows are in front of you. You're curling up like this. You can go all the way down, squeeze your tricep and lock your arm, and then come all the way up as far as you possibly can. That's a full range of motion for that lift, but it's not a full range of motion for your bicep because the full range of motion for your bicep is actually behind you, basically as far as you can stretch that muscle. So for a complete range of motion, you need to have something where your arm is in front of you like this, like a preacher curl. You do need to have some type of incline curl, whether it's with dumbbells, on a bench, on an incline, or even just on a cable where you're standing up facing away from the cable. You can never really achieve full range of motion for a muscle group just through one lift. There might be some variations out there, but generally in the big picture for your program, you do need to have a variety of lifts that target different ranges of motion for that muscle. So it's generally going to be best, and I do recommend this for everybody, to use one lift for a stretch and another lift for a contraction. So when I train my biceps, technically I'm not even doing this optimally. Biceps they're not something that I'm trying to desperately grow right now. You do need to have, in order for it to be optimal, a full range of motion throughout that bicep. So if I'm doing some variation, let's say I'm trying to train my biceps and basically for the next 6 months to grow them as much as I can. The best way to do that would be to do some type of curl where I get a really good contraction. So basically like a cable preacher curl, get a really good contraction, my elbows are in front of me, and then it would also be pretty smart of me to include, whether it's that workout or another point in the week, something where my biceps are in more of a stretch position. So like we talked about earlier, an incline dumbbell curl, or basically a cable curl where I'm facing away and my arms are behind me. That would be a full range of motion. So I'll touch on that a little bit more throughout this video. I do have a couple more points here. Basically, partials can work on lifts with basically bigger strength curves. So a really good example that I think a lot of you guys will be able to relate to here is going to be lat pull downs or pull-ups. So for most of us, a lat pull down is going to be like relatively easy until you get to like about eye level, maybe your hairline, kind of around your face where you're almost getting to that full contraction. The problem with this is relatively easy. Let's say you're doing a moderate weight to like 12 reps, you're coming down, and then you get to about that eye level with the bar, and it takes like every ounce of effort to actually get it to a full contraction, full range of motion, maybe below your chin or to your chin or something. And if you're trying to go for that full range of motion on every single rep, it doesn't make much sense because you're going to have to lighten the weight so much that this just becomes way too easy now. So in my opinion, it makes more sense to challenge yourself really good throughout the first 85%, 90% of the range of motion and just not do the last 10% and try to get that through a different lift than it does to basically sacrifice 90, 85% of that lift going super light. And then it doesn't make sense to just stop when you can't get it below your chin anymore. Like, you know, you're just cutting yourself short. It makes more sense to train the bigger part of that strength curve and the bigger range of motion than try and go through the literal entire range of motion, because no matter how strong you get your lockout, it's never going to be as strong as the first 90% of that pull. So next one I've got here is you get full muscle fiber activation through both full range of motion and from taking sets to failure. So my thoughts on this are, it's best to try and get your full range of motion through, or not full range of motion, I'm tired again today. It's best to get your full muscle fiber activation from taking a set to failure and utilizing basically lift variety to get the full range of motion, because with the strength curve of certain lifts, it just doesn't make sense to sacrifice a huge portion of the lift just so you can get a full range of motion. And this doesn't apply to everything, but it does apply to a lot of lifts. So if you can get full muscle fiber activation from either taking a set to failure or going through a full range of motion, you need to take a set in a very good proximity to failure to actually grow. You don't necessarily need to take a set to full range of motion or at a specific lift to full range of motion to actually grow from it. So it just makes sense logically to do it the way basically that I just said to you that I use in my training. You don't want to fail early from lifts with a big strength curve. So actually, you know what, I already kind of covered this point, but yeah, basically like don't sacrifice making a lift so easy just because you feel like you need to get a full range of motion. Just utilize another lift, one that gets you a good contraction, one that gets you a good stretch, and then any additional volume on top of that. And I think you're pretty much good to go for hypertrophy, obviously, as long as you are taking the sets with a good proximity to failure. So, all right, covered that. Yeah, and don't waste gains trying to always go full ROM. Like, there's certain lifts like that you just can't quite get 100% like range of motion on. Like the lat pull down, for example, it just doesn't make sense to sacrifice like 30% of the weight just so you can get like this last little bit that doesn't even do a whole ton for you anyways. So challenge yourself for the biggest range of motion, and some lifts are just, sometimes the strength curve is just really skewed in a suboptimal way for hypertrophy, and that's why we need lift variety to actually get optimal results and optimal muscle gains. So this next point is going to be calling out a little bit of the full range of motion hypocrisy. So a lot of these people are generally in favor of like heavy barbell compound movements, always go full ROM, just like really like by the books type of people. And there's nothing wrong with that way of thinking, because like in general, going by the books and by the standard methods that are kind of tried and tested, that's generally going to be the better way to go. You definitely can't blindly follow it, and that's pretty much why I have my channel in the first place. But a lot of these people, and a lot of the way that this logic works in their head, is you need to do a full range of motion to build muscle. So you need to lock out your deadlifts, you need to pull right off the floor from the deadlifts, and rack pulls aren't as good because they're not full range of motion. But a lot of this doesn't actually make sense, because why is pulling from the floor on a deadlift full range of motion? If full range of motion would technically be like pulling from the highest possible deficit you could and then like contracting every other muscle after that. Like, you can't get a full contraction or a full stretch on every muscle in deadlift. So why does it necessarily matter if you pull from the floor or pull from blocks or whatever? It just doesn't matter a whole ton, and it's definitely a little bit overrated and definitely kind of easy to blindly follow. I know that was a little side tangent, but generally the people that talk about like these big barbell movements being the best for overall growth, they don't really understand that, yeah, I mean, a deadlift is something that they would advocate for and they think it's the best lift for hypertrophy. The problem is that's like 10% of the range of motion for any muscle you're using in your back. It's basically just like a weighted stretch, like isometric. I mean, it just doesn't make much sense. So why are you so focused on like a full range of motion on a lift that is basically just a weighted stretch anyways? You know what I mean? So I'm not saying everybody thinks this way, but there's definitely some people that do, and it just, you have to start thinking a little bit more critically about this stuff. So to finish up, to put some practical advice in this video, so I can give you guys not just like kind of a little bit of a rant and analyzing this stuff, but to give you some practical advice that you can use in your training. Generally, to summarize what I said, you want to use exercise variety as the best way to achieve full range of motion. So pick a lift with a good contraction, pick a lift with a good stretch, and generally pick something where you can get a pretty good range of motion throughout that lift. I'm not saying just do half reps to do half reps. Maximize what you can of the strength curve. Doing 90% of a lift versus 100% of the range of motion of the lift is not really going to make a difference for hypertrophy, especially if that last 10% just totally skews the weight that you're actually able to lift on that exercise. So what you want to do is, the biggest priority is going to be, you need to get some type of weighted stretch with a decent range of motion on it. A lot of the lifts with a really good weighted stretch, you're not necessarily going to be able to get the best contraction on, but generally you do want to always put a muscle you're trying to grow in a good weighted stretch position. That's why some type of fly, or even like a kind of unlimited range of motion press, is going to be always important for your chest. So some type of fly, some type of weighted dip, or even a dumbbell bench, because you can go as far down as you need to versus where a barbell wouldn't allow you to do that. That's always going to be very important. I would probably prioritize that if I had to pick one over a lift that just gives you a really good contraction. Not to say the contraction's not important, but it's probably secondary to a lift that gives you a really good stretch. Optimally, you need to have both in your training. So that's pretty much all I've got for today. Just some random thoughts on this stuff. I just have a couple bullet points here. I do want to make a longer video where I do dive deeper and go obviously more than just a brief analysis, but either way,